think, well, if somebody does remember what we did last year, I'm sure everybody except me
I see
does.
the red light now. So
They can put it in the chat box because I see the red light is on. So yeah.
yeah.
Sorry if I seem nervous. It's my first time I'm introducing someone at a conference like this. But it is a great pleasure because I have had the honor of meeting Divya and listening to her speak at our Belta Day last year. And I'm sure that this presentation is going to be really great, just like the one that she had in Brussels last year. So let me see. Hold on. Let me just get the. Okay, so Divya Madhavan is going to talk to us about Assessment Unplugged, a case study. And she's a senior lecturer in language and education at Centrale Supélec Université Paris-Saclay. I hope that's pronounced well. Her courses are on the English language, education, and society, and her research includes critical pedagogy, assessment, and English as a medium of instruction. Divya has a Master's of Education in Education Research and has an MA in Language Education and is also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Divya, and I hope that you enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Vidrana. Can I? Okay, sorry. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me in this session today. And thank you, Luke, for an excellent plenary just now to open the conference. I'm a big fan of the Daily Show. It was the last episode last night, wasn't it? So I read this morning, I haven't had a chance to watch it, but I read this morning that that Jon Stewart said that the best offense against bullshit is vigilance. And if you smell something, say something. And I was thinking about that a lot in Luke's talk and about how we need to address all these forces that invade the space sometimes and how we can address them as teachers. And so I'm going to talk about action research, as I did yesterday for ITDI, but with a different lens today, as being one way of getting our voices out there and getting our needs and our contexts sort of in the foreground. So I'm going to take the conversation around looking beyond the standard when it comes to assessment a little further, but I'm going to take it further by talking about something very specific, which is my own practice, and I will give you a little bit of sort of theory and framework around what I'm saying. So feel free to, could I speak up? This was the problem we had earlier. Is this better, Gordana? I think my microphone is actually on this side. Yes, okay. All right. I'm going to talk about assessment and looking beyond the standard and how I think participatory pedagogy is linked to teaching unplugged and how I think this echoes the basic philosophy of teaching unplugged in a slightly broader sense. And after that, I'll go on to describe some of my own research. So those of you who know my work will know that I do a lot in the area of action research. So the project I'll be describing today is also an action research project, but I've only done one cycle of it, and it's ongoing. I'll be doing it again in September. So I thought it would be interesting to present something that was kind of in progress, rather than something I did a long time ago. And I think action research, as it's represented in ELT, kind of wears two hats. On the one hand, it's seen as a critical tool, a tool that is politically engaged and is concerned with bettering a given social environment. But I think it also has a slightly oversimplified representation where it tends to be talked about as a self-improvement tool that ticks the professional development box, sometimes void of politics or injustice or power or authority or identity, all these words that are sometimes a little uncomfortable to use. So I'm very much of the former school of thought when it comes to action research, and I think there's no point in doing it really if there isn't a fully fledged critical agenda that works towards a more democratic classroom. And I think what we've seen from Luke, I watched both of Luke's talks just now. He gave one for ITDI, more specifically on teaching unplugged, and the one on assessment that you all just heard. And I think, you know, what we can take away from that, that there's always a bigger picture and there's always a wider circle. And with teaching unplugged, I think it is so much more than a simple omission of classroom materials. I think it's a very socially engaged form of teaching that seeks to bring politics and social structures and common injustices into the realm of relevance in a curriculum. So I'm just going to start my slides. Um, so the idea of a critical ELT is by no means new. I would say in the sort of 1990s, we saw lots of publications around the politics of texts, and people began to analyze language and discourse and identity, and these debates have flourished and grown. I think perhaps the most well-known and widely studied of these texts is Alistair Pennycook's Critical Applied Linguistics, which is a staple on many MA programs. And it is an excellent book and I highly recommend it. And so the politics of text, I think, is something that English language professionals have been concerned with for a good long while. But with the politics of texts, inevitably comes the politics of contexts. And this is where I feel teaching unplugged can come to play a very, very important role. For those of you listening to perhaps a recorded version of this webinar, I'll just very briefly define teaching unplugged. It's a methodology or a movement that's fairly well known in ELT. A lot of people credit its birth to Scott Thornbury and Luke Meddings, who wrote the book with the title Teaching Unplugged. Many have tried to argue that it was just giving a label to a practice that already existed quite widely. But I think regardless of how it began and whom it began with, this book certainly formalized certain core ideas around this methodology. And so I will align my talk to those ideas. And the first is that teaching should be conversation driven. Second is that it should be materials light. And the third is that it should be focused on emergent language, so the lives and the language of the learners. I think it's very disappointing that teaching unplugged is sometimes interpreted as a throw out the technology and textbooks fad, because this imposes very unnecessary limits on it. And I don't think either of the authors would argue in favor of this either. If you're teaching in a technologically rich environment, by all means, use it to your benefit. But you know, it's not about the specific tools we use. I think it's much more about the philosophy of how we teach. So I'll focus a little bit on the third notion, on emergent language for the start of this talk, because I think the focus on emergent language challenges the tradition of what teaching is in a very pertinent manner. There's a really interesting definition of tradition in Foucault's work on the archaeology of knowledge, where he talks about tradition as being that which inhibits exploration. And it inhibits the exploration of what is truly embedded in discourse. And I think, you know, because the weight of tradition is always so big, isn't it? Tradition comes with this very formal structure and a very formal sort of network of how it needs to run. And so thinking about discourse and thinking about what is embedded in discourse, I'd like to introduce a phrase called dominant discourse. Some of you may know it already. It's a phrase that we use in critical pedagogy that describes the collective dimensions to knowledge. Knowledge in the dominant discourse is inevitably ideologically bound and typically tends to sanitize local social concerns. I'll give you a very simple illustration of this. I bumped into a friend in Athens in April this year. He doesn't live in Greece either. So we said hello to each other and he asked what I was doing there. And I said I was there for a conference of English language teachers. And at this, he raised his hands and said, English, you know, my children hate studying English because the textbook is full of London that I can't afford to take them to and all about the Queen, whom they'll probably never meet. Now, this is a very anecdotal example, but I think this disjointedness in terms of standard is perhaps one you might identify with. The standard of what we aspire to when we learn English, um, it's I think it's quite a complex thing. The English language is very often portrayed in terms of the cultural authority it represents. In my very first hour as an English teacher, I was introduced to a room full of Austrian students as having the perfect British accent. I don't, by the way, so please don't try and imitate me. But I was very surprised by this introduction because I'm not British. But I also very quickly realized the need for the language teacher, whose assistant I was, to establish my authority as a newcomer to the classroom space. And accent, as we all know, is the ultimate power card. So I am back to Teaching Unplugged and why I think it's such a profound project. I think its profundity lies in the fact that it says no to the standardized model of what language is. And it gives so much authority to the contextualized needs of language, and everything stems from their context. And I think at this time, also based on everything that Luke just said, I think at this time in education, we need to be a little bit bolder in articulating the needs of individual contexts and of cultural contexts and of historical contexts and of all the intertexts embedded in these very, very complex spheres, because there is this globalizing drive and a desire to sort of harmonize everything. So Paulo Freire, who Luke mentioned and whose name you're probably familiar with, is largely seen as a father figure in critical pedagogy. And I just want to quote him very briefly on the idea of the democratization of a learning environment. He describes the democratization of a learning environment like the opening of a fan. And he talks about the sort of economic, political, social, and cultural dimensions being the things that open up when you make a learning environment more democratic. And I'm going to quote him directly here, probably best from so he describes the image of a closed society as being one where people are submerged in reality. And with the opening of society, people emerge and are much more than mere spectators. So I'd like to draw what I think is a very robust link between this idea of emerging people and emergent language. And it is the materials light factor that facilitates this sort of emergent language. And I think that philosophical purpose deserves a little bit more clarity sometimes. So why am I talking about assessment unplugged? For one very simple reason, the link I see between speaking exams and power. So I think that, by the way, Branka, if you're still in the room, I completely agreed with your comment earlier about needing to trust teachers more to assess their students. But I also think that it depends on the teacher. And I think when a teacher becomes an oral examiner, especially for their own students sometimes, they tend to be inflated into this sort of superstate examiner. And it's very interesting to observe the different strategies people use to maintain this state. Some people use props, some people invent rules of conduct that didn't previously exist, some people become overly strict. But there always is a bit of a difference between a teacher as a teacher and a teacher as an examiner. And obviously, this is stating the obvious, there would be a difference in such roles. But also in an oral exam, I think a student gets sort of deflated into a slightly sub-state of being examined. They stop being referred to as the student and you suddenly refer to them as the candidate. And this kind of, I think this superstate, sub-state business affects our decision-making. And I think it's quite, it takes quite a lot of pedagogy to manage that space successfully and manage the complexities of that space successfully. let me tell you another little story. About 4 years ago, um, when I was still an examiner, I've examined on ELT exam boards, and I've also examined on my local French exam boards. I've seen two very different sides to the scene. And about 4 years ago, I had a conversation with an examiner on our candidates and the general discipline of examining. And he said to me that he found himself particularly strict with candidates who arrived dressed up and seeking to impress through physical appearance. Now, obviously, there's some legitimacy in this statement because there is appropriate and inappropriate attire in an exam, and but I also think we would agree that how a person is dressed doesn't automatically tell you how they're going to speak English. So this very simple example, I think, teases out the notion of cultural capital. Cultural capital is a phrase I like to weave into my talks a lot because I think it's a little underrepresented in education. It's very talked about in the field of sociology, but I think it needs to be spoken about a little bit more, especially in the area of language education. So cultural capital is all those things that help us move up in society. I have a great image for this. I was so delighted when I came across this Lego sculpture by Nathan Sawaya because it illustrates what cultural capital is so beautifully. It's a phrase coined by the French academic Pierre Bourdieu, and it refers to all the little extras that help people change their position and change their situation in the socio-economic world. Their education, their intellect, the way they speak, how they carry themselves, and even how they dress in certain circumstances. And this comment from my fellow examiner, I feel sort of brought that to the fore a little bit. Um, and this is exactly it. Look at the Lego sculpture. It is efforts that we make based on our skills, based on our understanding, and most importantly, based on the tools and resources that are available to us. And this is what helps us move up. We get better jobs, we get better opportunities, we get access to more sophisticated education, we travel, etc. And while this is obviously partly the result of financial assets, it's also the result of non-financial assets, which is what makes these things very difficult to measure. And more importantly, what makes these things have very different measurements across cultures. And this is one of the most difficult things to be genuinely neutral about in an assessment context, I think. And this is particularly pertinent when it comes to our role as English language teachers and our role in facilitating the acquisition and the sort of broadening of the English-speaking world. We witness every day how learning English gives people access to better jobs, to better education, and to better income. And while this is perhaps a very necessary phenomenon, the spread of English, it isn't necessarily a neutral phenomenon. And I think this particular side to our practice needs more narrating, because there are lots of links between language and power, and we can't pretend that those links aren't really there. And so with all this talk around language and power, it gets me to the very heart of critical pedagogy. And I think one of the most pertinent definitions of critical pedagogy comes from Henry Giroux himself, who wrote a book called Critical Pedagogy, which I highly recommend. And he says that critical pedagogy is not for teachers and students to simply consume knowledge, but to transform it. It is not an armchair type of state where we think about something and we suddenly experience it differently. We need to engage with knowledge. We need to go beyond reflection and go into the sphere of action. So some of you may have seen the talk I did yesterday on action research. It's available on ITDI, so I won't go into much detail on what action research is, because it's probably 2 clicks away for you. So I'm just going to share one of the projects I was on last year, a research project that I designed, and how I tried to unplug my assessment of my students' spoken English. This is my slide for the project. So, My basic premise and my reason for doing this study was that no matter how strongly I identify with critical pedagogy as an educator, unless I make an explicit attempt to transform the voice of authority in my classroom, I find myself always slipping into being the knowledge-heavy teacher who pours information, who gives information, who instructs with information onto the students. And there's a specific context that led to this thinking. So last year I was using Teaching Unplugged with a group of students. So I planned what to do from week to week. I wrote down so much of their language in my journal. I made little activities from what I perceived were their interests. And I had a twofold problem after a few months. The first problem was that my students were required to take my class to obtain the necessary number of credits to pass their year. And my second problem was that they were very good in English. So they'd all done work placements in English-speaking countries, they'd all traveled extensively, and they were the products of highly language-aware environments. They watched English-speaking media, they read in English, they had a lot of engagement with the English language. And also they all had done their TOEFL, which is the institutional requirement for language. So having ticked that box, that assessment box, they came into this learning space with very, very little to learn, as it were. So inevitably, I observed a progressive disengagement with the course material, and what I could only describe at the time as students on autopilot. Students were present and they participated politely, but there was a lack of commitment and perhaps more importantly, a lack of excitement about being there. So after the sort of initial buzz at the start of the year, everything sort of died down and the responses waned, and I observed a sense of letting go in the students in terms of responsibility for course content. So it's all very well to say conversation-driven materials, slides, and emergent language, but what happens when you don't get it? And what happens when you lighten the materials load and there's suddenly no materials? So this was the conundrum I was faced with. And how I ended up responding to this initially was by systematizing the content. So I would ask question A to one student, who would respond. I would ask the same question perhaps 3 times. I would structure the next 3 lessons based on the information I'd elicited and my interpretation of what their interests were. But as you can probably see for yourselves, this very rapidly cascaded into being this very teacher-heavy model and what Henry Giroux calls the teacher routinization, despite the best of my intentions. So any teaching methodology is always subject to the volatility of the classroom environment because we never quite know how things are going to go. So I found myself about 3 months into the course with this problem. And I remembered at this point something that was said to me when I trained as a teacher 15 years ago, that tests were an extremely effective tool for reviving stagnant classroom dynamics. I remember exactly what this teacher trainer said to me. There's nothing like a spot test to wake everyone up. Now, the idea being, of course, that everyone would be awake to their responsibilities and why they were in the room, and that was my problem. I felt that they weren't giving me all that emergent language I was looking for. But I remembered it, and yet it felt completely counterintuitive for me because it felt like a direct root of my basic problem of being uncomfortable with using speaking tests as a power card. And yet I knew that I had this very powerful tool in my toolkit because all these students needed to be assessed on this course. So I wanted to find a responsible way of reviving the methodology of Teaching Unplugged and finding some of that emergent language that simply wasn't being created the way I was doing it. So I wanted to use the test and I wanted to incorporate it into my tools, but I didn't want to use it as an evaluative end because that felt like the power card, oh, you didn't really sort of engage with my course, but here's the test and this is what you have to work to. I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to set progressive, methodologically relevant goals. So I wanted to remain within the methodology of Teaching Unplugged, but I wanted to weave the assessment into the model. So I made the decision of allowing for more student voice in the syllabus by taking it to a much more explicit level of participatory pedagogy. Participatory pedagogy is when curricular needs emerge through interaction between teacher and students. It's a relational process where decisions on syllabus, design, implementations, all of these are actually made by the students themselves. Now, this is a little ambitious in the middle of an academic year, but again, I was lucky to have a very strong group of students, and I knew they could probably handle significant shifts in what we were doing. So I'll leave you to imagine the power of this level of student decision under the right scaffolding. And so this was my attempt to teach against the grain by not teaching, and to take a physical seat back and use my teaching expertise differently. So over a period of about 4 or 5 months, I formally yielded two things to my students: my decisions around what needed to be assessed and the teaching that sort of led us to that assessment. So what was my role, you might ask? Well, I was a fellow student a lot of the time. I sat with my students and I did the work. And I was also a sort of teaching consultant. I asked students to come and see me during my office hours to go over what they prepared and make sure that they felt able to communicate it. And this is where my own teaching expertise remained very useful to the classroom as a whole, because I was just no longer center stage, but I was still using a lot of my methodological knowledge. So now I'm going to talk you through my action research in 4 stages, the stages where I plan, act, observe, and reflect on the changes that happened. So the planning phase of the intervention involves establishing a schedule with the students and ensuring that the aims were clear to everyone, obtaining ethical acceptance to conduct the study from the institution, and deciding on the content areas that my students would prepare to teach. Now, my involvement in the preparation of their materials was much more focused on how they would gather information, how they would process it, how they would prepare what they wanted to do. And we also talked about a lot of basic communication with the class, and I just had to make sure that they understood that this wasn't about giving a presentation to their classmates, but actually communicating and having a dialogue and teaching them something. So this phase took about 3 weeks, and it was fascinating for me to observe the kind of content that they decided on. I suspected that they would, I sort of, my hunch was that they would do stuff that was really, really easy, because it would mean that they wouldn't have too much work to do, too much extra work to do for their English class. But actually, they did things that were quite difficult. They brought in subject areas from other disciplines that they were doing. So these are university students, and so their other courses. They brought that into their language classrooms, and they decided to work on it in English because they felt that would be professionally quite useful, and that also gave them a little extra time to communicate with their peers on these subject areas that they found difficult. So I suddenly found myself plunged into the deep end of not really knowing the subjects, because it wasn't in my sort of typical scope of what I would talk to my students about. But I think one very positive outcome of this was that they gained the autonomy of what happens when in the world of work, doesn't it? In terms of knowing that particular kind of time management and using your time for reading and for working very efficiently. And that's what they were doing. They were just using their time more efficiently by working on other subjects, but working on it in English and having a language lesson with it. So the action phase involved students teaching their portions of the syllabus, and some students chose to pair up for this because a lot of them had overlapping interests. And it also involved a second phase meeting with me after they'd done their teaching to decide how their content would be assessed. So each student lesson lasted about 40 minutes and each student taught twice, which in retrospect I think is a real minimum, because continuity is a very, very necessary thing. And this is definitely one of the things I would change in the design in future stages. So I filmed them doing their teaching. I kept a journal for the informal exchanges that took place when I stopped filming. And I also, I did a group interview at the very end. That's it, and I transcribed that as well. So this action phase was when a sort of decentering of my voice as the teacher took place. Um, this created a space for multiple and often very conflicting student voices, and yeah, there was a lot of energy in this phase, I would say, and I didn't feel like I had much control sometimes, which is probably a very good thing in retrospect. The observation phase mainly took place in the intervals between teaching events. So there was overlap between my action and observation phases. And I noted down the changes that I witnessed in the group behavior. So ownership of the classroom, commitment to the course, and the issues of disengagement I'd previously been so worried about vanished almost overnight. So after the assessment, which I'll describe in a minute, I did the group interview and tried to understand what the students' observations were. And I was especially curious to observe whether students would put forward more substantial suggestions for syllabus content, and how it could structure the course differently next year. But they didn't really go with that. And I also sort of the total. Well, let me just. The total time frame for this was about 2 months. So I had a sort of 3-week phase, and then I had a sort of 2-month phase with a bit of overlap between action and observation, and then there was probably another extra few weeks of observation after that. The reflection phase, the final phase, was a collective effort and took place some weeks after the course had ended. I realized that not every teacher will have the luxury to do this because we often just see our students disappear the minute the course ends. But I had my students living on campus and I was on campus almost every day, and I had free-flowing tea and biscuits in my room to entice them to come and talk to me. So this took about 10 days, and I was doing the reflecting, they were doing the reflecting, and we were thinking on the whole about how the project changed it. So one major limitation of this as a piece of research is obviously the fact that I only did a single cycle, but this is also very often how we fall into research. We have a puzzle, or we have a problem, and we try to find a way to make it better. We do a bit of action research, and we kind of only get there once we're in the process. So I don't see this as a bad thing, but it was a very interesting project, and definitely one that I'm going to go into September with a plan already and ready to put into practice. So now I'll chat to you a little bit about what came out of my student interviews. I hope that's okay. I see a very quiet chat box, but that's fine, I guess. So the first conversation I titled, "Was That Really a Language Lesson?" So it was a conversation I had with one student who had a very successful lesson, what I thought was a very successful lesson. There was a lot of engagement, a lot of interaction. But then in her second interview with me, she asked, did that count as an English lesson? And I asked why she said that, and she said, well, there wasn't any explicit language teaching. There was no grammar. There was no pronunciation. And so we chatted about, how one teaches language, how one teaches language to advanced level learners. And in the course of the conversation, she said, well, we were talking to each other as if we were English speakers and not French in real life. And I sort of said, that makes it a language lesson in my books. But I thought I'd be quite transparent about that because I know that not everyone subscribes to sort of content language integrated model. So the other conversation that I want to cite here is where a student expressed discomfort with preparing assessed work because he said, I can't assume that people are learning this or that thing from my lesson. Now that led to a very interesting conversation because we talked about how we take away lesson content that has personal meaning or relevance, but it's so much harder to remember things that don't feel important to us. And so this is where I learned a lot as a teacher about motivation being the result of relevance and not just interest. And that was 15 years into teaching. Um, it was a very interesting moment for me because it doesn't have to be interesting or entertaining or fun. Learning doesn't always have to be fun. It just kind of really has to be relevant and in the right zone. And then you have motivated people in the room. So I'll talk to you a little bit about my data. Obviously, in limited time, I can't present too much of it. But there were three main sources of data, as I said earlier. There were the video recordings of the student-conducted lessons. There was the transcript of the recorded interview, and also the notes that I kept in my journals, which included the sort of individual conversations I had with students. So I watched the video recordings twice, and I took notes on the main themes. I took my notes sort of horizontally, and then I tried to look at these sort of horizontally and vertically. I tried to look at categories that went sideways, so in sequence, in chronology, and I also tried to look at sort of bigger picture categories that were emerging. If I could just offer a very practical suggestion here for those of you who are going to do action research, transcribe in very big print and print it out and use multicolored marker pens and look for your categories of discourse, and don't hesitate to reprint it and read it again afresh at the end. I think when you transcribe, you should always do it on the computer because it's a much more efficient way of working with the data later. So, and then I also compared these emerging themes to my own reflective journal. So my overall reflection and core themes led me to sort of three broad areas. The first is perspective, and the second is dialogue. I've just put them in one slide. So one of my students said, I started this out by saying, from a teacher's perspective, you see everything. It's terrible, she said. And the theme of how powerful physical change in perspective recurred consistently throughout the research. And it wasn't always positive, I mean, the participants described this new position in the class not as something exciting or powerful as I'd expected them to. I heard very mixed responses. They said things like it felt strange. They felt underprepared to take on the responsibility of being a teacher. And then there were some students who said, I felt no different. I'm just going to get my notes as I don't misquote you. I felt no different to having a normal conversation with my friends. Another student said, I could see so many me's in the room playing on their mobile phones and not concentrating. It was very scary. And then I had a few students who were extremely positive about it as well. I felt more confident about learning than when I just have to sit there and listen. I was in charge of the knowledge. It was great. So in one classroom, I had so many different responses, and this is what I meant by the sort of volatility of the teaching environment and the methods that you apply to it. You never quite know what's going to come out of it. So the particular insight here on classroom dynamics and discipline is really very interesting. And this instant shift in perspective is very emblematic of the messiness involved in teaching. And I'll just briefly quote Smith, 1995 years old, just I'm boring academic, but teaching is characterized by uncertainty, by rupture, dissonance, tentativeness, provisionality, and self-disclosure. And I think it's just a fantastic description of teaching, really. So the second broad area is dialogue. And there was a very easy flow of dialogue, as you probably guessed, between the teacher and the student because the roles were mixed up. And I noted with some jealousy, to be honest, how my students, when they were in the role of the teacher, they would just ask a question and get an immediate response from their peers. Everybody was helping with the process a lot more than when it was kind of me, the teacher, desperately looking for my emergent language. So The dialogues in this class were interesting and sometimes really quite animated. Um, and a lot of this also challenged my initial expectations of the situation. I thought the dialogue would be a purely enjoyable part of the process, and certainly that's what it looked like to me when I was sitting among the students observing it. But then suddenly, in the interviews, I had a little bit more stuff that came out, and one of my students said, "Yeah, it's good that everybody talks when you're giving a lesson, but it's very hard to sound like you're in charge then." And that was an interesting comment. You know, so it's actually she perceived it as a good thing that the teacher had more talk time because then you sounded more in charge. Um, and it's another comment that was very interesting that I've highlighted here is that it's always hard to create real communication around classroom topics because it just doesn't feel normal because we're so conditioned to learn in a certain way. So this is, I suppose, you know, I was teaching 20-year-olds, so you have all that baggage of all those years of education. Um, yeah, then so a lot of people, you know, teased out this idea of it being quite difficult to create communication around a topic. So there was a single instance where things got a bit unmanageable for me, and where the lesson steered completely away from its original stated purpose. So this is something I'd be quite transparent about as well, because these unexpected things always happen in research. So when I was observing what turned out to be an extremely animated discussion, a total failure of the sort of what I perceived to be a total failure of the moment, because everybody just left feeling quite upset. And the teacher, the student who was in the role of the teacher, didn't quite have the classroom management tools to um, to sort of, you know, reel in the moment. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the question from Ian. Unplugged conversion communities around from does it appear to the ability to self-assess? Yes, it's a very, I'm going to save that and put it to one side, but I will come to that at the end. So what I perceived as a moment of breakdown, my participants perceived as an interesting, if not enjoyable, moment in the interviews. And I'm reporting this because I found it a very interesting mismatch between what I was thinking as a teacher and what my students were feeling as students. So I'll read one quote from the interviews here. "If you go through all that you plan to do, you do it as it should be done, but it's boring. What's a lot more fun is when things get messy and things go just a little bit off topic, because we learn a lot more then and we're challenged." So it's a lovely quote, and I was very grateful for that level of honesty in their sort of self-assessment of the moment. So the third thing I'd like to talk about is responsibility, um, and yeah, this theme of when you have to teach something, you take it a lot more seriously, recurred a lot through the project. I observed a total change in commitment towards the course, and I was particularly impressed by how extensively the participants researched their contributions and prepared their lessons, largely unprompted. Um, and you know, the comment about taking the subject more seriously when you teach it um, showed a real shift, I think, in role and responsibility and ownership of the classroom. And sort of at the very end, some of the students came back to me saying that, you know, this was far more interesting than any other English course we've had, because you don't come to class, watch a TED talk, to comment on it and do a gap. Now, that is a very powerful you know, statement for me, because I've been perfectly guilty of getting students to watch TED Talks and comment on them. So, so these aspects of the project were highly appreciated by all the participants, and obviously I feel very excited about doing a new cycle of this in a month's time. So what did the assessment model look like? How did this responsibility for the classroom translate into assessment? Well, it was based on conversation, it was materials light, and it was focused not only on emergent language, but the emergent needs of the situation. So the overall theme that I saw in how they prepared their assessment was, it's no good knowing something if you can't use it. So there was a lot of emphasis on practical, real-life applications of what was being taught. One part of the assessment was to write a short pitch for research funding, for example. They're all science students. Another part was to evaluate the importance of a given subject area in the syllabus. So they created the syllabus and weaved the creation of the syllabus into the evaluation, which I thought was very interesting. And the evaluation is based on the real world relevance of it and real world examples of why it might be useful or why it might be useful, and to give arguments as to why not. Another section of the exam had a highly technical question that I would never have been able to write myself because I don't study the same things as my students do outside our time together in the language class. And so it was this sort of dual challenge of talking about this highly technical thing in English and talking about it in English. So there was a lot of, again, the interdisciplinary nature of it. Slightly took me by surprise, but was excellent and a huge learning curve for me. So because everything was so participatory, it was their content, their exam, I felt, and this hopefully might answer your question really, I felt that the assessment grades should come from them as well. And John, if you could cut and paste the link we chatted about earlier, it would be great. So a couple of years ago, I used a model of student-driven exam rubrics. And that's the blog post I wrote on it in 2013. And so I showed this to my students when we neared sort of assessment time. And I will let you read about it. It's just got sort of a 7-step what my students came up with as being criteria for evaluating. And I asked them how they would like to adapt it to their assessment and what they would like to sort of incorporate from what they do. Now, one thing that happens when you do an action research project is that you get a little bit tired towards the end. And this is also another very real aspect of being a researcher. So we were nearing the end of our course. The students had done a sterling job on so many things, and they'd done a sterling job on writing the exam. But the sort of rubrics was the thing we just didn't quite have time to prepare with enough with enough care, I would say. So this bit wasn't a completely smooth ride because what they ended up doing was just sort of saying, yes, that sounds fine, we'll adopt that, instead of personalizing it a little bit more. So I hadn't sufficiently anticipated the stress that this would cause. And one participant, once she was in there assessing, came back and said to me, I don't really know what grade I'm giving. Like I gave a grade last week, but then I saw the person do it this week, well, another person do it this week, and that sort of adjusted the grade I would have given last week in my head. Now, I sort of admitted to her that I used to go through the same thing as well. You always tend to assess based on everybody else being assessed. I think that's not an unnatural thing. But that's where my response was, oh, we needed better rubrics. So this will be the first thing I correct in my next cycle of action research, is working on the rubrics in a much more detailed and much more context-specific way. So, so also on the subject of rubrics, in the feedback at the end, a lot of my students said how useful it was having a framework actually and having a set of rubrics, and they all admitted that they too would have liked to have had more time in setting it up. So I see that my time is running out, so I will move on a little bit from the data. So lots of ways really that participatory pedagogy can make its way into a classroom. I've given you one example, and I've tried to be very detailed and very transparent about where I went wrong and what I got right, and I hope you found it helpful. I think when we talk about research, we tend to, I think we tend to leave the complicated reporting to the journals that are often behind firewalls. I don't think there's enough honesty with difficulties of research in the sort of public discourse. So that's also what I tried to. What do they get? Yes, Cloudy, that's exactly what I was saying. So they got it about 2/3 of the way through. Is the answer to your question. Um, and so they didn't get it at the very end. But I think what I would do next year is definitely work on it from the beginning, so that it's very, very personalized from the beginning. So yes, I hope you were engaged and interested in the presentation. I'm very happy to chat or take any questions right now. If you have any comments, and of course you feel free to talk to me later about this. And I hope that if there were any of you who were interested in doing action research, you might be a little bit more interested after this session.
So thank you, Divya. That was very, very interesting, very thought-provoking. As Divya's already said, we do have a couple of minutes for questions. So if you have any, you can type in the chat box.
Okay, so I had two questions at the end, sorry. So I was left with two questions at the very end of my research. This is one of them. Are teacher and student roles more porous than we think? And this is me trying to look at the positive aspects of what came out of my project. So the bits where the students felt very empowered, where the students took responsibility for their classroom, and where they went away and did all this research and did all this very good thinking around their work. And the other question I had is sort of back to what I experienced at the beginning, where I was using Teaching Unplugged, but I wasn't getting the emergent language. And how I responded to that was by making it systematic, by giving my classroom a structure. And so the question I'm left with is, what is the link between power and routine in the classroom? Thanks, Sinead. I think honesty is very underrated, really, and I don't think research is weak. I think any research is weak if it's transparent about its sort of less successful elements. I think transparency is one of the most important things in action research, and if we report on a study with only the sort of positive bits and what was great about it, I don't know if much was learned. If we knew why we were going into it before we went into it, what was the point in doing it? So if the students had as part of it, yes, they did, Ely, but they'd done it the year before. And they'd all sort of sailed through the TOEFL without any problem. So that was part of my problem, was that I couldn't sort of scare them with a big standardized test that they needed to prepare for or anything, as I've seen people do. So no, they ticked the standardized test box. They'd done their work placements and they were with me for their final year and didn't really need to be there and needed the credits for their overall degree, basically. That was the context of the research. Oh, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Belta. It's always such a pleasure to work with you.
We are very glad to hear that, Divya, and it's a great pleasure for us too. I don't think there are actually any other questions at this point. We'll just see if Ely has something to say. Maybe while we're waiting for. Oh, right. Great. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to remind everyone that we now have a break coming up. The break is 30 minutes, so we'll be back here in the Belter room and in the Tesla Toronto room at 7 p.m. Central European time, and hold on, let me just, and 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now know it's not Seaboard. Okay, so thank you very much, Divya, once again. Thank you everyone for coming, and
Thank you,
we'll see you.